Would you like to be somebody who understands what shadow archetype projections are and how they can manifest themselves? Then listen to this entire video where I first explain what the shadow archetype is and how it can try to communicate with you through projections. So before we get into this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to learn more about self-development, dating, and how to reduce suffering in life. Let's get into it. Now, the shadow archetype is part of Jungian psychology. It is referring to a part of your psyche which contains all the traits and characteristics, aspects about yourself which you generally dislike, which you are ashamed of, and you don't want to attribute to yourself. Because, we want to attribute ourselves to the positive characteristics and not to the negative ones. So typically, our shadow contains behaviors that are socially unacceptable because, firstly, like, for example, brutal violence or certain sexual urges. Because in order to survive, it is very important to be included in a social group. Because, as in the Game of Thrones, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. If you're in a group, your rate of survival is a lot higher. And if you're alone, you're ostracized, you get lonely, become lonely, and you essentially die. So we are primed to really make sure we stay included in a group. And that means we need to hide our socially unacceptable traits in order to fit in and not be ostracized. Now, every single human has a shadow. It is simply part of our human nature. And the shadow exists in relation to the human ego, which Carl Jung referred to as sort of the human consciousness, your individual consciousness. So everything you're aware of. So you're aware of the things that you like about yourself, which you want to attribute to yourself, the positive traits, and you try to hide the negative traits and put them out of your consciousness into your shadow. So like if you have your ego here, your shadow lies behind it in the unconscious. The greater your shadow, the more, the greater the size of your shadow, the more unaware you are of the things you dislike about yourself unconsciously, and the greater the threat of your shadow. The bigger the shadow, the bigger the threat. Because the shadow is unconscious, so you're not aware of it, and in the right situations it can manifest itself and get triggered, and it will autonomously take charge of your behavior and your thoughts. For example, if you consider yourself a very peaceful, non-violent person, under the right circumstances, all that repressed aggression and violence can be unleashed and will take control of you, and you'll be a slave to this urge for violence, and you can end up producing pure and utter evil without actually wanting to produce it. It's like some alien energy takes control of you, some foreign person takes control of you and just wreaks havoc. Now, in general, you can think of the ego consciousness and the shadow as sort of like a game of dominance, of domination. The less space the ego controls, the greater the shadow, because the shadow consumes that and incorporates that which you are unaware of. So if you are unwilling to attribute undesirable traits to yourself and you sort of try to ignore them, your shadow will be denser and bigger because it will encompass more space. So you are kind of like shutting the blinds on your darkness and you do not want to look at it. Whereas if you are conscious of your, let's say, undesirable traits, then your ego has more space and encompasses more of your psyche, and it integrates the contents of your shadow into itself. Now, one thing what needs to be said is, obviously, facing the shadow is quite painful because it's not easy to face the fact and accept that you have certain undesirable traits, and that's why a lot of people don't face and integrate their shadow. And like, there's a common theme in Carl Jung's writings, in that you can only ascend, so rise up, after you have descended. So every ascent is preceded by a descent. And he deemed sort of the path of individuation started with integrating the shadow. That's the first path to becoming a whole person, is first facing your darkness. Now, if we move on to the projections, this is what the video is about. One of the symptoms of your shadow, or ways it can manifest itself, is projections, which occurs in the following. This is what occurs. So, we judge people. We judge people often negatively. You may judge someone for what they're wearing. Let's say you judge someone for wearing uncool or boring clothes. You're a very fashionable person, let's say, and you dislike it when people don't give an effort to dress well. Then you judge others for wearing boring clothes and being boring people. The reason why you're judging them is because being uncool is something that you are capable of yourself, and something that you are afraid of attributing to yourself, so you push it into your shadow. Perhaps, for example, when you were younger, you were not part, let's say during high school, you were not included in the cool social group, and that really hurt you, but you were very insecure about it. You really wanted to be validated and be cool, but you weren't. And eventually, as you grew older, you changed your behavior, you grew more confident with more experience, and you adopted a sense of fashion. But the fact that you were excluded from the cool group as a teenager left a wound. And because you were very insecure about it and you deeply wanted to be validated as a cool person. Now, since you became confident now, you by all means never want to be uncool again because it hurt you so much. So you push your history of being uncool and the trait of being uncool into your shadow because you really despise it. Now, whenever you see someone who you think is uncool, you judge them like, that person isn't cool, you know. And it's because you have that trait yourself. You have been it in the past, and you detest that trait, and therefore it's in your shadow now. It's unconscious. You're not really aware of it, and it projects itself onto other people. So we tend to project those traits we dislike about ourselves onto others. And it really seems whenever we judge someone badly, it really is that trait precisely that we have ourselves, whether we're conscious of it or not, that we actually then project onto the others. And this makes a lot of sense to me because, you know, people are very complex and diverse. You could judge people on so many different attributes. The number of potential traits it's enormous. So you could ask yourself then, why would you choose that specific characteristic to judge someone on? Like, it must have to do something with you. Like, you chose that trait to judge them on. And the reason you chose it is because it has to do with you. You are capable of that trait. You have that trait within yourself. And I can really encourage you to reflect on who you have judged and what you have judged them on in the past. Try to think whether you have that trait yourself, because the likelihood that you do have it is quite high, and it is there lying in your shadow, that trait. So be conscious of that. So the key with the shadow is to reduce it in its size and bring it into your consciousness. So be aware of your projections. Now, you may ask yourself, okay, well, why do projections occur? Why does our psyche do this? Now, our psyche is trying to bring our shadow into consciousness because that is what will help us develop and strengthen as individuals and become wise. It's what Carl Jung called the process of individuation, which is integrating the unconscious contents of your mind into your conscious mind, and that he deemed as the most valuable thing in life. And that's how you become a whole person. It's almost how you become godlike. Now, your psyche projects your shadow onto others because it thinks that you can get to like the other person who have these traits, and that will enable you to accept these traits in the other person and actually think, if I can accept these traits in someone else, maybe I can accept them within myself, and I can actually integrate them into my consciousness and who I am and my personality. So, and then you'll be a more authentic whole person. It's a clever trick, but most people aren't really aware that this occurs nowadays. I mean, I certainly wasn't aware of this, that I projected those traits that I dislike about myself onto others, but it makes sense now. Your psyche is trying to find a way to bring it into your consciousness. So what you need to do is you need to realize that you're projecting it because it is part of yourself, of who you are, and you're afraid of attributing that characteristic to yourself. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of this content of this video and the projections I learned from a YouTube video from the channel on YouTube called The Diamond Net, which is very useful, and I will link in the description if you'd like to check it out. I will probably do another video on the shadow soon, on how to integrate it, which is quite useful and really the key, I'd say the trickier part in regards to the shadow archetype, because it's easy to understand the archetype, but to actually integrate it is a different story. So in conclusion, the shadow archetype is the subset of our psyche which contains all the contents which we dislike about ourselves and we don't want to attribute to ourselves. And if we're very unconscious of who we are, of all the bandwidth of all of our characteristics, especially the bad ones, the shadow can also contain good ones, but mainly the bad ones, let's say. It contained good ones in that, let's say as a child, you had a trait which was very useful, like you were very good at maths, but the rest of your family wasn't good at maths, and they bashed you for getting good grades at maths, let's say. And so you pushed the skill of mathematics into your shadow, which is actually a good trait, but it's in your shadow. And the bigger your shadow, if your shadow is bigger, it's because you're more unconscious of who you really are, let's say. And the bigger it is, the more dangerous it is, because it can take hold of you, and the likelihood of it autonomously taking control of your behavior and your thoughts is quite high, because it is bigger, it is darker, and it is stronger. And that can be very dangerous then, because you will unconsciously behave in ways that might be very damaging to yourself and those people around you. And a way that the shadow manifests itself is projections, where you project those characteristics which are in your shadow, which you dislike about yourself, onto others. And it's important to be aware of these things, and it's actually a great tip to figure out, it's kind of like advice on how to figure out those things you dislike about yourself, which is super useful actually. If you know this stuff, it's very powerful. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to learn more about self-development, dating, and how to reduce suffering in life. Thank you for listening.